okay? So it's important to know how to factor because factoring leads us to solving quadratics. And this is really what we're going to use a lot this year is solving the quadratic. So in geometry, just like you see, we don't usually factor. We usually factor in order to solve so we can get a solution. And that solution is usually going to be a side length or an angle measure or something like that. When you are solving, you're going to notice two things. One, the given problems are going to have an equal sign. That's when you know you're going to solve. And your answer is going to be x equals some number, and usually x equals two numbers. Because it's a quadratic, so you're going to have two solutions. So there are some steps that you should follow. And again, if you need to, go ahead and pause. But the first thing you need to do is make sure that you set the equation equal to 0. Always get all the terms on one side of the equal sign. Then you're going to factor, again using GCF or dots or the x, and then you finally solve. Now I'm going to be referring to these 3 steps a lot this school year because we're just going to be solving quadratics a lot. And so these are 3 steps you really should focus on. So let's take a look at number 13. Out of those 3 steps, this equation is already set equal to 0, so we don't have to move anything around. On the left-hand side, I see that this quadratic is already factored, so the first 2 steps were done for us. So the solving part means you take those 2 factors and you set them equal to 0. So you say 2x minus 3 equals 0 and x plus 8 equals 0, and you solve these mini equations. And so we get that our first solution is 3/2. If we subtract 8 from both sides here, we get that our second solution is -8. So these are the 2 solutions to that quadratic. Okay, let's take a look at let's go down actually to number 16. So following those 3 steps that I had written below, the first thing we need to do is set this equation equal to 0. So I'm going to move the 32x over to the left-hand side. So I'm going to subtract 32x from both sides. So the equation equals 0. Now the second step says to factor. Well, there's only 2 terms, but they're not perfect squares. I should definitely take out a GCF first. So I'm going to be left with, so 2x is my GCF. I'm going to be left with x minus 16. Just like before, when I'm factoring completely, I'm going to look inside at that leftover quadratic. I see that I can use dots here. Just kidding. We can't factor that. It's just x minus 16. So we're done factoring this quadratic. So once it's in factored form, we take each of the factors and we set them equal to 0. So we're going to say 2x equals 0 and x minus 16 equals 0. And then solve. Divide both sides by 2. X is 0. Add 16 to both sides. X equals 16. So our solutions here are 0 and 16. We can move over to 17. Following these steps, again, we want to set the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to move the 67 over. So I'm going to be left with x squared. 3 minus 67 is -64 equals 0. I'm going to factor out a GCF of 4. Be left with x squared minus 16. Now, unlike the other one, I'm left with dots in the middle. I can factor by dots, so the 4 stays in front. 1 plus 1 minus, it'll be x plus 4, x minus 4. And now I'm going to set each of the factors equal to 0. So this is where you have to be really careful. Only factors that have x in it can be set equal to 0 because we're solving for x. Since this GCF doesn't have an x in it, we're not going to set it equal to 0 because there's nothing to solve. We want to solve for x. So x plus 4 equals 0 means that x equals -4. X minus 4 equals 0 means x equals +4. So we have those 2 solutions. All right, let's just follow the pattern. We'll keep snaking through these. Number 14. So here, the quadratic is already equal to 0. I can take out a GCF, which is 4. So I'm left with x squared plus 3x plus 2. I'm going to look inside the leftover quadratic and try to factor it some more. I can factor this as a trinomial, thinking of two numbers that multiply to 2 and add to 3. And that would be 2 and 1. So actually, I can continue factoring to say that, here we go, x plus 2 and x plus 1. So I factored it completely. So that step 1 was making sure it equal to 0. Step 2 was factoring it. Now step 3, I'm going to solve and set up little mini equations to solve for x. So when I solve these, x equals -2 and -1. Okay? Again, let me just remind you of the 3 steps here. Make sure you have it written down. Maybe put on a note card or post it somewhere. Highlight this so you can always come back to it. These are the 3 steps for solving quadratics. Number 15, only 2 more examples. First thing we need to do is set this equation equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract the 2x over so that there's nothing else on the right-hand side. And notice how I wrote it in standard form. It was the x squared plus bx plus c. So here I'm going to factor it using the x. So what 2 numbers multiply to -3 and add to -2? That's going to be -3 and +1. +1. So my factors are x minus 3 and x plus 1. Once I have those 2 factors, I can set them equal to 0, and I'll get x equals +3, x equals -1 by solving those 2 mini equations. And finally, the last one, you guys are right there, you did it. We're going to, again, go through those exact same steps. We have to solve, set the equation equal to 0. So I always want to make sure my x squared term is positive. Since it's already positive, I'm going to move the other terms to that term. So 2x squared minus 2x minus 24. Remember, I'm moving them over the equal sign, so you have to flip the signs. Now we need to factor completely. So first I'm going to take out a GCF, x squared minus x minus 12 equals 0. Then I'm going to look at the inside leftover parentheses and factor that. So what 2 numbers multiply to -12 and add to -1? Those 2 numbers are, let's see, we're going to have a -4 and a +3. So our factors will be x minus 4 and x plus 3. So we factored completely. The last step, remember, we only want to set the factors with x in it equal to 0. So these 2 have x's. The GCF doesn't have an x in it, so we don't have to set that equal to 0. So x minus 4 equals to 0 leaves us with x equals +4, and then x equals -3. Awesome. So again, these last 6 problems here should be your biggest priority as you're looking at finishing up this lesson and looking back over. Really make sure you understand these 6 problems. And if you don't, please make sure you ask me a question in class tomorrow, or come in early, or go to the tutoring center. This algebraic skill is going to come up a ton this year, so you want to make sure that you feel really confident with it, and when you see these problems, you know exactly what to do. We'll be practicing them some more tomorrow, so please, please, please ask questions, and I hope you guys have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow.